So the Republican-controlled United States Senate just voted to override Donald Trump's entire Canada trade policy. Not a symbolic resolution, not a non-binding statement of concern, not a letter signed by a handful of senators expressing polite disagreement. Binding legislation passed with a veto-proof majority of 71 to 29, with 22 Republican senators voting yes, stripping the president of the tariff authority he has used for 18 months to wage economic war against America's closest ally, and mandating the restoration of normalized trade relations within 90 days. The President of the United States stood in the White House and threatened every single Republican who voted for the bill. 22 of them voted for it anyway. A sitting president's own party just passed legislation that directly contradicts his signature foreign policy initiative over his explicit, public, furious objection, with enough votes to override the veto he has already promised. This was not a protest. This was not a warning shot. This was the governing machinery of the Republican Party concluding that the president's Canada strategy had become so economically catastrophic for Republican voters in Republican states that defending it was no longer compatible with holding a Republican majority. Within hours, the White House called it the greatest betrayal in the history of the Republican Party. Warren Buffett called it something else entirely, the most predictable event in American politics. Because boards always remove the CEO when the CEO becomes the risk, and the only question is ever how long it takes. But it is what Senator David Whitfield said on the Senate floor before the vote. 11 words delivered by a man who had defended this president through 2 impeachments and every controversy of the past decade. That tells you this isn't a legislative disagreement. When you hear what triggered this vote, what was said in the closed-door Republican caucus meeting that lasted 5 hours, and what Buffett says about the moment institutional survival overrides personal loyalty, you will understand why this is not a setback for the White House. This is the day the Republican Party decided to govern without the president. Here is a question for you directly. Do you believe this Senate vote represents a genuine institutional course correction, a return to constitutional checks and balances, or is it simply Republican lawmakers saving their own political careers after the economic damage became too deep to ignore? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. Let me take you through exactly what the vote did because the specifics tell you how fundamental this rupture is. The legislation, the Canada Trade Normalization Act, does 4 things. First, it revokes the emergency trade authority the president invoked to impose tariffs on Canadian goods, retroactively declaring that no qualifying emergency existed and returning tariff-setting authority to Congress. Second, it mandates the restoration of pre-conflict tariff rates on all Canadian imports within 90 days and establishes a joint congressional commission to oversee future bilateral trade policy, removing the White House from the decision-making chain entirely. Third, it requires the State Department to restore full diplomatic relations with Canada within 60 days, including reopening consular facilities and reestablishing the Joint Border Management Framework. Fourth, it formally apologizes on behalf of the United States Congress for the disruption of the bilateral relationship caused by executive overreach inconsistent with congressional intent and American values. That 4th provision, the formal apology, landed like a detonation inside the White House. Congress does not apologize for presidential actions. It has no precedent. The inclusion of an apology clause in binding legislation represents Congress publicly declaring that the president acted outside the bounds of American values. The vote count, 71 to 29, means that more than 2/3 of the Senate, including 22 members of the president's own party, put their name on a document that describes the president's policy as inconsistent with American values. This is not a policy override. This is an institutional repudiation. And the veto-proof margin means the president cannot stop it. The names on the yes vote tell the story of how complete the rupture is. Senator Rebecca Hale of Texas, the chair of the Republican Policy Committee, a woman who had stood beside Trump at 17 campaign rallies. Senator Thomas Erickson of Iowa, the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, whose state's farmers had been devastated by the loss of Canadian market access. Senator Catherine Morales of Florida, a first-term senator who had won her seat by running as a Trump loyalist and who had voted with the president 96% of the time. Senator James Lankford of Georgia, the man who had organized Trump's defense during the second impeachment. But what forced these 22 Republican senators to take the most politically dangerous vote of their careers was not principle, it was math. Specifically, the economic math arriving in their states, in their town halls, in the faces of the voters who were demanding to know why defending the president mattered more than defending their livelihoods. The cumulative economic damage from 18 months of confrontation with Canada had reached a scale that could no longer be explained away. The numbers were devastating, and they came from American sources. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that 218,000 American jobs had been lost in industries directly affected by the Canadian trade disruption. The USDA calculated that American farmers had lost $19 billion in export revenue. The Department of Energy reported that natural gas prices in border states had increased between 40 and 70%. The Commerce Department's own internal analysis concluded that the trade confrontation had reduced American GDP growth by 1.3 percentage points, costing the economy approximately $340 billion in output. Those numbers, American numbers from American agencies measuring American damage, were the ammunition that senators carried into the closed-door meeting where the decision was made. And what happened in that closed-door meeting is the part that will be studied for decades. The Republican caucus meeting was convened by the majority leader on a Tuesday evening. It was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 5. By the end, the majority leader sat in silence for the final 30 minutes, his head in his hands, while the caucus he led dismantled the coalition he had built. The meeting began with a presentation from Senator Erickson, who had prepared a 40-slide briefing on the state-by-state economic impact built entirely from federal data. By slide 19, 3 senators who had entered the room intending to defend the president were visibly shaken. By slide 30, Senator Lankford of Georgia stood up and said, "I've been telling my voters that this is working. These numbers say I've been lying to them. I'm not going to do it," Senator Hale of Texas spoke next, her voice carrying an exhaustion that multiple people later described as the sound of someone who had been holding something back for months. She said, "I have spent 2 years defending this policy in private calls with CEOs who are closing factories in my state. I have spent 2 years telling myself that the president sees something I don't. He doesn't. The factories are closing, the farms are failing. And the president's response to every piece of evidence is to demand more loyalty. I am done being threatened into silence while my state burns." The White House, alerted to the meeting's trajectory, launched a pressure campaign in real time. The president personally called 6 senators during a break. Those calls were later described as threatening, abusive, and in one case, the most abusive phone call I have received in 30 years of public service. He promised primary challenges. He threatened to redirect party funds. He suggested that senators who defied him would never work in Republican politics again. Senator Morales of Florida returned from her call and told the room what the president had said. That account was the moment multiple participants identified as the point of no return. The threats that had once kept the caucus in line became the evidence the caucus needed to justify its decision. The president was not offering a path forward. He was offering submission or destruction. And 22 senators chose a third option the president had not considered. They chose their voters. The vote on the Senate floor the following afternoon had the quality of historical inevitability. The galleries were packed. Every camera in Washington was trained on the Senate floor. Senator David Whitfield of Tennessee, a 3-term senator who had shared the president's defense during both impeachments, rose to speak. Whitfield spoke for 7 minutes. His voice was low, measured, and carried a weight that several reporters later described as grief. He began with the economic data, then moved past the numbers into something more fundamental. "This vote is not about tariffs," he said. "It is not about Canada. This vote is about whether the United States Senate is a governing institution or a loyalty test. For 2 years, I have watched this body subordinate its judgment to one man's will. I have participated in that subordination. I told myself that loyalty to the president was loyalty to the movement. I was wrong. The costs are not short-term. They are being paid not by the president, but by the workers and families who trusted us to protect their interests. He paused, looked directly into the camera, and said 11 words that landed with the quiet force of a door closing permanently. He gave us a choice, him or them. We chose them. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the majority leader nodded once, a gesture so small that only the closest cameras caught it, but that political analysts would later identify as the moment the institutional weight of the Republican Senate shifted permanently away from the White House. The roll call began. When the count reached 67, the veto-proof threshold, an audible exhale moved through the gallery. The final count was 71 to 29, 22 Republicans, every Democrat. The Canada Trade Normalization Act passed with a margin that the president could not override, could not delay, and could not negotiate away. And here is the paradox that will define how this vote is remembered. From Trump's perspective, this is the ultimate betrayal. 22 members of his own party siding with the opposition to strip him of authority. He posted within the hour that the senators were traitors who would be destroyed in primaries. But from the party's perspective, the vote was not betrayal. It was self-preservation. The senators did not abandon the president because they stopped believing in him. They abandoned his policy because the policy was destroying the voters who keep the party in power. A party that cannot protect its voters cannot win elections. And a party that cannot win elections ceases to exist. The vote was the institution saving itself from the leader. The senators did not betray Trump. Trump's policy betrayed the senators. The vote was the senators acknowledging that reality and choosing institutional survival over personal loyalty. And institutional survival is the one force in democratic politics that no leader, however powerful, can overcome. Institutions do not love their leaders. They use them. And when the leader becomes the liability, the institution discards the leader and continues. Warren Buffett's response addressed the systemic pattern with the precision of a man who had watched this dynamic unfold for 7 decades. He did not discuss politics or trade. He discussed the one dynamic that governs every institution. In 70 years of sitting on boards, Buffett said, I have watched the same scene play out more times than I can count. A CEO accumulates power, the board defers. The CEO interprets deference as loyalty. The CEO begins making decisions that serve his own interest rather than the institution's. The board absorbs the damage for a while, but there is always a threshold. There is always a moment when the cumulative damage crosses the line and the board members ask the question that changes everything. Is keeping this person worth losing everything else? And the answer, once the question is asked, is always no. What happened in the Senate this week is a board revolt. The senators concluded that the president had become the risk to 114,000 jobs, 19 billion in farm losses, 340 billion in GDP. Those are not political opinions, those are audit findings. And when the audit findings say the CEO is destroying the company, the board acts not out of courage, not out of principle, but out of self-preservation. That is not heroism, that is math. And math does not negotiate. Buffett continued, the CEO retaliates. The retaliation fails because the CEO's power depended on the board's compliance. The remaining loyalists calculate whether their own position is sustainable. And the calculation always produces the same result, more defections. Because the first defection changed the math for everyone. Before the vote, defiance was risky and loyalty was safe. After the vote, defiance has proven survivable and loyalty has proven costly. The incentive structure has been permanently reversed. Institutions always outlast the leaders who mistake them for extensions of themselves. The consequences cascaded with the speed that Buffett predicted. Within 1 week, 4 additional Republican senators who had voted no announced they would vote to override the president's veto. The majority leader issued a statement whose careful neutrality was itself the message. He had chosen not to defend the president. Major Republican donors issued statements praising the vote as responsible governance, telling every remaining senator where the money would flow. Polling in the 22 senators' states showed approval of the vote ranging from 54 to 71%, with the highest numbers in the states where economic damage had been most severe. The math had turned, and as Buffett observed, math does not turn back. Canada's response was notably restrained, with Prime Minister Carney welcoming the restoration of the bilateral relationship, denying the White House any foreign antagonist to rally against. Allied nations issued statements praising the institutional resilience of American democracy. The message from the democratic world was unanimous. The system worked. The institution corrected itself. So here is where we stand. The Republican-controlled Senate passed binding legislation overriding the president's Canada trade policy with a veto-proof majority of 71 to 29. The legislation revokes emergency tariff authority, mandates trade normalization, restores diplomatic relations, and includes a formal congressional apology for executive overreach. The president's retaliatory threats landed in a political environment where the fear mechanism that sustained his control has been structurally broken. Senator David Whitfield stood on the floor and said 11 words that will be studied for as long as democratic institutions are studied. He gave us a choice, him or them. We chose them. And Warren Buffett explained why the pattern is always the same. Institutions protect themselves, not their leaders. Any leader who mistakes institutional compliance for institutional loyalty discovers the difference at the moment it matters most. Can a president govern when his own party has demonstrated the votes and the willingness to override him on his signature policy? If the fear that held the coalition together has been publicly broken, what holds it together now? And the question that extends beyond this president to the foundational architecture of democratic governance itself. When the institution ejects the leader to save itself, when the party votes against the president to protect the voters the president was harming, is that a failure of loyalty, or is that democracy working exactly as it was designed to work? Trump demanded loyalty from his party. Instead, he discovered that loyalty has a price. And when the price is measured in closed factories, bankrupt farms, and voters who can no longer afford to heat their homes, the price exceeds what any party can pay. He tried to make defiance unthinkable. Instead, he made loyalty unsustainable. He believed the institution existed to serve him. Instead, the institution reminded every future president, that leaders serve institutions. Institutions serve voters. And voters are the only loyalty that a democracy cannot override. The Senate gave the country 11 words that answered the question every democracy eventually asks. What happens when a leader demands that the people who serve the public choose between the leader and the public? He gave us a choice, him or them. We chose them. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.